Imagine this, a clay tablet resting in a darkened chamber, its surface etched with symbols already old when the fire that hardened it went cold. Tonight, traveller, you did not arrive here by chance. Across forgotten epochs, patterns repeat, and somehow they have guided you to this quiet moment. What if the earliest records of civilization were never meant to describe a beginning at all, but a recovery after something was lost? Archaeology tells us that Sumerian cities emerged with astonishing speed, complex urban systems appearing in just a few centuries, a pace that still unsettles modern models of gradual development. It is as if memory resumed mid-sentence. These tablets speak like echoes, not origins, like a signal fading across deep time, still precise, still waiting to be understood. Let's follow the silence together. Imagine this. A clay tablet cooling beneath an ancient sky, its surface still warm from fire while above it the stars drift in patterns, already old, already indifferent. Dust settles slowly the way time does when it has learned patience. Tonight, traveller, you're not here by coincidence. Long nights, long chains of cause and effect, gravity, bending memory itself have drawn you to this moment. Somewhere between science and silence, the universe has arranged this meeting quietly without announcement. It often does. I remember nights like this in the lab, lamps dimmed, instruments humming softly as if they were breathing, maps spread across tables, their edges worn thin dust, gathering in the creases like sediment in a dried riverbed. When you study deep time long enough, you stop expecting answers. You start listening instead. The Sumerian record feels like that. Not an opening statement, but a signal already in progress. When we read the earliest tablets, they do not glow with the excitement of invention. They feel restrained, careful, as if the writers were standing on unstable ground, aware that too much movement might cause everything to collapse again. What if civilization did not begin with a spark, but with a recovery? What if the first written words are not the dawn, but the afterglow of something already burned away? Archaeology gives us dates, layers, measurements. It tells us that cities appeared rapidly in southern Mesopotamia complex almost immediately, as if a switch had been thrown. Writing emerges not as poetry but as accounting. Lists of grain, counts of labour, names repeated, order imposed. Science calls this administration. But beneath it there is something else, a posture. The scribes do not ask how these systems came into being. They behave like caretakers arriving after a disaster focused not on origin, but on stabilization. Writing here feels less like creativity and more like containment. Memory externalized, hardened into clay as if human minds alone could no longer hold what mattered. In physics, we know that systems near collapse behave differently. Energy is conserved tightly, noise is reduced, redundancy increases. The Sumerian world reads like a system operating under constraint conserving order, the way a star conserves fuel near the end of a cycle. Their myths echo this. The gods do not invent endlessly. They regulate, they assign, they withdraw. Power circulates but does not originate. Even creation stories feel administrative, as if existence itself has a ledger balances to be kept. Thresholds not to be crossed. Silence appears again and again, not ignorance but restraint. Flood stories are told not with fascination but with acceptance. The catastrophe is not analysed, it is acknowledged. Afterward, life resumes smaller, quieter, more bounded. Lifespans shorten, authority tightens. The universe recalibrates like a system shedding excess mass. In astronomy, when a star collapses, it does not announce the beginning of something new. It compresses. It becomes denser, more controlled. Sometimes it leaves behind a neutron star, a relic, spinning silently, holding immense gravity in a space barely larger than a city. Sumer feels like that kind of remnant, a civilization compressed by loss. The king list reinforce this impression. Before the flood time stretches impossibly long, after it time contracts sharply. This is not progress, it is reduction. Human existence becomes narrower, more fragile. The texts do not celebrate this shift, they simply record it. Acceptance replaces triumph. There is a humility here that feels almost scientific, an understanding that the universe does not owe us continuity. That order must be maintained carefully, ritual by ritual, measure by measure. That deviation invites erosion. Erosion, after all, is time thinking, slowly, relentlessly. Geology teaches us that landscapes remember catastrophes long after stories fade. River channels shift, salt poisons soil, entire cities vanish without fire or war, simply abandoned when alignment fails. Mesopotamia carries these scars everywhere. The land itself refuses permanence. In such a world, beginnings lose their power. What matters is not how something started, but whether it can still function tomorrow. Civilization becomes a practice, not a narrative, a discipline. When I hold these tablets in mind, I don't feel mystery pressing to be solved. I feel gravity, a weight pulling attention inward toward care, toward repetition, toward survival. Somewhere beyond our reach, something ancient still moves. Not a lost golden age, not a hidden empire, but a memory of reduction, of narrowing, of learning to live with less. And so the Sumerians speak from the middle of things. They do not shout origins, they whisper instructions. They show how to hold a world together after something essential has already slipped beyond recall. In the end, traveller, it's all right to not understand. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Imagine this. A scribe pauses, stylus, hovering above damp clay while outside the river shifts its course again, quietly undoing last season's certainty. The tablet waits. The world does not. Observer, when we speak of evidence, we often imagine something solid. A measurement, a layer of soil, a line of text that finally settles a question. But the Sumerian record offers a different kind of evidence. Not a revelation, but a pattern. Not a declaration, but a discipline repeated until it becomes invisible. The earliest tablets do not tell stories. They count. Sheep, barley, labour days, offerings delivered at precise intervals. The handwriting is careful, restrained, almost anxious. Errors are corrected. Lines are recopied generation after generation. This is not the excitement of invention. This is the focus of maintenance. In long nights spent with data, you learn to recognize this posture. When a system has experienced shock, it stops experimenting. It documents. It stabilizes. In physics, after an energetic event, particles settle into lower states. Noise decays. Order tightens. The Sumerian archive feels like a civilization cooling after catastrophe. There is evidence in what is missing. No celebration of firsts, no pride in discovery. Writing appears not as a miracle but as a tool. Mathematics is used without explanation. Calendars already align with celestial cycles. Knowledge arrives fully shaped like a fossil whose living form no one remembers. Archaeology mirrors this restraint. Urban layouts appear suddenly coherent. Streets align. Temples follow shared proportions. Administrative systems span regions too quickly to be explained by slow experimentation alone. It is as if fragments of an older operating system were installed rapidly before memory could fade further. The land itself offers clues. Southern Mesopotamia is unstable ground. Rivers migrate. Floods erase decades in a night. Salt creeps upward, poisoning fields invisibly. Entire settlements vanish not violently but quietly, leaving behind nothing dramatic enough to remember. In such conditions, continuity becomes an achievement. Evidence is not stored in monuments alone, but in repetition. Rituals repeated precisely. Measurement standardized early and rarely changed. Time segmented into cycles that return reliably, even as cities fail. In astronomy, we learn that clocks are built where drift is dangerous. Pulsars mark time because their regularity survives chaos. Sumerian calendars feel like that. Not curiosity-driven, but survival-driven. Time measured so that alignment does not slip unnoticed. Even the gods reflect this logic. They do not create endlessly. They administer. They assign roles. They withdraw favour when imbalance grows too large. The divine realm behaves less like imagination and more like regulation. Authority flows, but it does not originate. This is evidence too. Cultural evidence. When myths focus on transfer rather than creation, on restoration rather than invention, they reveal a memory shaped by loss. The flood narratives are not origin stories. They are reset protocols. Excess is reduced, noise quieted, parameters tightened. Afterward, the world continues under constraint. In the lab, when an experiment fails catastrophically, you don't rebuild the entire apparatus from scratch. You salvage what still functions. You reinforce weak points. You simplify. You write everything down because memory alone can no longer be trusted. Writing in this sense becomes a technology of fear. Not fear of the unknown, but fear of forgetting what still works. The earliest tablets feel urgent. Fields must be counted. Workers assigned. Offerings tracked. Accuracy becomes ethics. This urgency explains why the record feels mid-sentence. Civilization is already underway, already heavy with obligation. There is no space for reflection on beginnings, because the present demands attention. Survival leaves little room for nostalgia. There is evidence in language itself. Sumerian stands isolated, unrelated to surrounding tongues. Like a survivor, language carrying concepts from a vanished linguistic ecosystem. Later cultures preserve its words even after it stops being spoken. The structures outlive the voices. This persistence suggests inheritance, not innovation. In geology, we know that after mass extinctions, ecosystems reorganize using what remains. Evolution accelerates, but within constraints. New forms emerge rapidly, but they are built from surviving templates. The Sumerian world feels like a cultural analogue of this process. Rapid organization, limited variation, strong conservatism, even creativity follows rules. Art adheres to canonical forms. Architecture repeats proportions. Music follows established modes. Variation exists but quietly, cautiously, as if deviation itself is risky. Evidence accumulates not as proof of a lost golden age, but as proof of adaptation. Civilization behaving like a system that knows how easily it can fail. When you look long enough at the tablets, the question shifts. It is no longer, why didn't they record the beginning? It becomes, why would they beginnings promise freedom? They suggest that things could have been otherwise. For a civilization living under constant environmental and cosmic pressure, such openness is dangerous. Speculation invites instability. Silence protects alignment. This silence is not emptiness. It has structure. Like dark matter, it shapes behavior without announcing itself. It bends attention inward toward preservation. Sometimes late at night, when instruments quiet and data stops arriving, you feel this same gravity. The sense that not everything wants to be explained, that some truths persist best when left unforced. The Sumerian record feels like that kind of truth. Evidence layered not to reveal an origin, but to hold a present steady against erosion. In the end, observer evidence does not always point backward. Sometimes it points inward, toward a civilization that learned to survive by narrowing its gaze, conserving order, and letting the beginning dissolve into silence. Tonight the universe whispers again. Imagine this, a city rising almost all at once, streets aligning, before stories can form walls, standing before anyone remembers laying the first stone. From above it looks deliberate, from within it feels inherited. Tonight, traveller, we arrive at the anomaly, the place where evidence no longer settles comfortably into explanation. In science, anomalies are not errors. They are signals. They tell us where a model is incomplete, where reality refuses to behave the way we expect. Sumer is full of them. Archaeology shows that the transition from scattered settlements to fully structured cities in southern Mesopotamia happens with startling speed. Within a relatively short span, we see standardized bricks, administrative districts, temples, oriented with precision labor hierarchies already functioning. This is not the slow, tentative emergence we expect from a civilization discovering itself for the first time. It feels compressed, like time folded. In astrophysics, we see similar behavior when matter collapses under gravity. A cloud drifts for millions of years, diffuse and unremarkable. Then suddenly collapse accelerates. Structure forms rapidly. A star ignites. Not because something new appeared, but because conditions crossed a threshold. Sumer feels like a threshold event. The anomaly deepens when we examine what is not present. No experimentation phase preserved in text. No mythic pride in innovation. No narrative of trial and error. Instead, systems appear already calibrated. Writing arrives already optimized for administration. Mathematics appears already functional. Astronomy is already cyclical, already predictive. Civilization behaves as if it remembers how to operate itself. This is not proof of lost super-civilizations or forgotten empires. It is something quieter and perhaps more unsettling. It suggests that the builders of early Sumer were not inventors standing at a blank beginning, but inheritors standing amid fragments assembling what still worked before it vanished again. Anomaly appears again in the king list, before the flood rains stretch into impossibility, tens of thousands of years. After the flood they collapse into human scale. This dramatic contraction is never explained. No apology, no clarification, just acceptance. Time itself seems to change its behaviour. In physics, constants sometimes shift under extreme conditions. Inside stars, time behaves differently. Near massive objects, clocks slow. The Sumerian record treats time as if it has already passed through something intense, something that altered its flow. The myths mirror this distortion. Gods once close, now distant. Humans once long-lived, now brief. Knowledge once direct, now mediated through ritual divination and text. This is not framed as progress. It is framed as aftermath. The anomaly is emotional as much as structural. The tone of the texts is calm, restrained, almost subdued. There is reverence but little excitement. Fear but disciplined. Pride but muted. This is not the voice of a civilization intoxicated by its own emergence. It is the voice of something older, tired, careful. I've seen this tone before, not in ruins, but in data, in long-running experiments that survive near failure. After enough close calls, systems stop expanding. They focus on stability. They trade ambition for reliability. They become conservative not because they lack imagination, but because imagination carries risk. Sumerian culture behaves this way everywhere you look. Innovation happens quietly. Change disguises itself as restoration. New kings claim to rebuild ancient plans. New temples follow old footprints. Authority justifies itself as alignment with what came before. This insistence on return rather than departure is anomalous for a supposed beginning. Even language behaves strangely. Sumerian words for institutions, rituals, and technologies appear fully formed, resistant to internal breakdown. Linguists notice this opacity, as if the language itself carries fossilized concepts from a vanished cognitive environment. In evolutionary biology, we sometimes find traits that no longer serve an obvious function, but persist because they once did. Vestigial structures, genetic echoes. The Sumerian lexicon feels like cultural vestigiality, concepts surviving without full memory of their origin. Another anomaly lies in the gods themselves. They are not creators in the dramatic sense. They are regulators. They distribute roles, enforce limits, withdraw support. Their conflicts are bureaucratic rather than epic. The cosmos they inhabit feels managed, not imagined. Creation myths, when they appear, are strangely practical. Humanity is made to solve a labour problem. Existence carries obligation from the first moment. There is no innocence, no golden dawn, just assignment. That tone is unusual. Most cultures mythologize beginnings as expansive, hopeful, luminous. Sumer frames existence as adjustment, as compromise, as living within parameters already set. The anomaly persists in architecture. Temples repeat proportions across centuries. City layouts follow familiar logic even after abandonment and resettlement. When collapse occurs, rebuilding often happens nearby, not on the ruins themselves, as if the ground remembers something dangerous. In geology, fault lines behave this way. After rupture, pressure redistributes. Future structures avoid the exact fracture point. Civilization seems to do the same. Even catastrophe is treated anomalously. Floods, famines, city destructions are mourned but not anatomized. Causes are framed as imbalance, excess, withdrawal. The mechanism remains opaque. The event is accepted, not dissected. This is not ignorance, it is restraint. In science, when a system is too complex to model accurately, we often avoid perturbing it unnecessarily. We measure outputs, we maintain conditions, we do not pull it apart just to satisfy curiosity. The Sumerians seem to have adopted a similar philosophy toward reality itself. All of this leaves us with a quiet contradiction. A civilization of extraordinary sophistication that avoids explaining how it came to be, a culture deeply invested in memory that chooses silence at its deepest boundary. That silence is the anomaly. It suggests not a missing chapter, but a sealed one. Not because it was unknown, but because opening it offered no benefit to survival. Some knowledge destabilizes more than it illuminates. Late at night, when the room is dark and instruments glow softly, you sometimes encounter this limit in your own work. A question that can be asked but should not be pressed. Not because it is forbidden, but because the system you are studying is too fragile to survive the inquiry. Sumer feels like a civilization that learned where that line was. The anomaly is not that they lacked beginnings. The anomaly is that they lived as if beginnings no longer mattered. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. And tonight, Traveller the Anomaly does not demand resolution. It asks for patience, for the humility to recognize that some civilizations speak most clearly through what they choose not to say. In the end, it's all right to not understand. Imagine this, a chamber where clay tablets are stacked in careful rows, their surfaces pressed with symbols meant to last longer than voices. The room is quiet, not empty, but intentionally still, like a space designed to protect something fragile. Silence here is not absence, it is structure. Traveller. When we move deeper into the Sumerian record, silence becomes impossible to ignore. It is not the silence of ignorance nor the silence of forgotten skill. It is deliberate, measured, almost practiced. The scribes who filled these tablets were capable of immense detail. They recorded numbers down to the smallest fraction ritual steps, down to exact sequences, celestial cycles with patient precision. And yet, when it came to beginnings, they stopped. This stopping is not random. In scientific observation, silence often signals a boundary condition, a point beyond which data becomes unstable where noise overwhelms signal. When studying complex systems, you learn that not every variable should be exposed. Some must remain fixed, unexamined if the system is to continue functioning at all. The Sumerian silence feels like that kind of boundary, how offerings are made. These texts are procedural, almost mechanical. They do not ask why the system exists, they assume it does. Civilization is treated not as a question, but as a condition. Silence surrounds the origin of that condition. This silence shapes behavior. When origins are not narrated, identity shifts away from ancestry and toward performance. One belongs not by knowing where things began, but by doing things correctly now. Ritual replaces memory. Precision replaces explanation. The present becomes more important than the past. In long nights spent reviewing data, you sometimes feel this same shift. At first you want to understand everything. Then, after enough complexity, enough failed models, you learn to accept that understanding has limits. You focus instead on maintaining coherence, on keeping the system from breaking. The Sumerians appear to have reached this posture early. Their myths hint at loss without detailing it. There are references to a time when gods were closer, when lives were longer, when order felt less constrained. But these hints never solidify into narrative. They remain impressions, shadows at the edge of language. This is not accidental. It suggests that whatever lay behind those impressions could not be integrated safely into the present order. In psychology, trauma often produces this effect: memory fragments. Certain events are not narrated linearly, not because they are forgotten, but because revisiting them destabilizes the self. Silence becomes adaptive. It allows life to continue. Civilizations can behave this way too. The Sumerian world was unstable. Rivers shifted, floods erased settlements, fields failed silently as salt crept upward through the soil. Collapse did not always announce itself. It arrived gradually, then suddenly. In such an environment, certainty becomes dangerous. One learns to trust procedure over speculation. This helps explain the tone of their texts. calm, restrained, rarely exuberant. Even joy is formal, even grief is structured. Lamentations follow prescribed patterns. Praise adheres to ritual forms. Emotion is present but contained like energy stored safely within walls. Silence plays a role here. It prevents excess. It limits the spread of destabilizing ideas. It keeps attention focused on what can be controlled. Origins cannot be controlled. They invite reinterpretation. They open space for alternatives. For a civilization living close to collapse, such openness is a risk. So silence becomes discipline. The gods themselves model this discipline. They do not explain their own origins. They do not narrate the structure of the cosmos in philosophical terms. They issue decrees. They assign roles. They withdraw favour. Their authority is accepted, not interrogated. The universe operates like an administered system, not a story being told for understanding. In this framework, asking how civilization began is like asking how gravity began. It may be interesting, but it offers no guidance for surviving tomorrow. What matters is how gravity behaves now, how to move within it without falling. Silence, then, is practical. Even writing reflects this attitude. Early texts are not reflective. They do not ponder. They anchor. This field belongs here. This offering was made. This labour was completed. Writing fixes relationships in place so they do not drift. It is a technology of stabilization. When memory is threatened, explanation becomes secondary to preservation. This is why the record feels like it begins mid-sentence. It does not seek narrative completeness. It seeks continuity. It speaks to those already inside the system, not to future readers seeking origins. Its audience is the next generation of caretakers, not historians. There is a quiet confidence in this. No need to persuade. No need to justify. The world simply is. The task is to keep it aligned. Late at night, when you sit alone with maps and instruments, when the noise of the day fades, you sometimes feel this same acceptance. The realization that not knowing everything does not weaken your position. It clarifies it. You work within limits. You respect boundaries. You let certain questions rest. The Sumerians seem to have done the same. Their silence is not empty. It exerts pressure. It shapes behavior. It teaches restraint. It says without saying that some knowledge belongs to a time no longer compatible with the present, that some beginnings cannot be safely revisited. This does not mean the past is denied. It is honoured indirectly, through repetition, through fidelity, through the careful maintenance of forms whose origins are no longer accessible, but whose function remains vital. Silence becomes a form of memory. In cosmology, we speak of background radiation, a faint echo of the universe's earliest moments. It tells us something happened without telling us exactly how. It is enough to shape our models without revealing the full event. The Sumerian silence feels similar. A background hum, a constant reminder that something preceded the present order, something powerful enough to leave traces but distant enough to resist narration. Somewhere beyond our reach, something ancient still moves. And perhaps that is why the record remains so calm. It does not try to reclaim what cannot be reclaimed. It accepts distance. It builds within it. Civilization becomes an act of careful living, not of explanatory conquest. In the end, traveller silence here is not a gap to be filled. It is a space that allows the world to stand without collapsing under the weight of unanswerable questions. Some mysteries wait, others watch. Tonight, it is enough to listen. Imagine this. A layer of earth, pressed flat by time, its surface calm and ordinary, while beneath it lie traces of structures no one remembers building. Stone aligned under sediment, patterns hidden under silence. The past does not announce itself. It waits. Listener, as we move deeper, the sense of a forgotten epoch begins to take shape. Not as a lost golden age with shining towers or advanced machines, but as a quieter absence, a stretch of time that once held coherence, now dissolved into fragments that refuse to assemble into a story. The Sumerians seem to have lived with the awareness of such an epoch, not as a legend to be recovered, but as a condition already past. Their texts gesture toward it indirectly. A time when gods were closer, a time when boundaries were looser, a time before reduction. These are not dates or eras. They are differences in state, like physics describing phases of matter. Solid becomes liquid. Liquid becomes gas. What existed before did not merely happen earlier, it existed differently. In science, we learn that systems can pass through phase transitions. Water freezes, metals crystallize, space itself changes structure as the universe cools. After such transitions, returning to the previous state is impossible without immense energy. Memory of the former phase survives only in residual patterns. The Sumerian world feels like a system after such a transition. They do not describe the earlier state because it no longer applies. Its rules cannot be used. Its logic would destabilize the present. Whatever that earlier epoch was, it belonged to a world with different tolerances, longer lives, greater proximity to forces now distant, less need for mediation, record-keeping, ritual containment. The present world is tighter, narrower, more regulated. This narrowing is visible everywhere. Human lifespans contract dramatically in myth. Authority becomes conditional. Knowledge is partitioned. Access to the divine is mediated through priests, omens, and texts. Direct experience gives way to procedure. The world becomes manageable, but at a cost. That cost is possibility. A forgotten epoch is not necessarily superior. It may have been unsustainable. Abundance invites excess. Excess invites collapse. The Sumerian stories do not romanticize what came before. They acknowledge it with restraint, almost relief. The flood reduces noise, population is cut back, order is restored under stricter limits. Reduction is not failure here, it is survival. In environmental science, we see similar patterns after collapse. Ecosystems simplify, diversity decreases, energy flows stabilize. The system becomes less vibrant but more resilient. Sumerian civilization reads like a cultural ecosystem that has already shed complexity to avoid extinction. This explains the obsession with repetition, with cycles, with alignment. When a system has lost flexibility, precision becomes everything. Calendars must match the sky. Rituals must be exact. Measurements must be consistent. Error carries disproportionate risk. The forgotten epoch lingers not as nostalgia but as warning. When I think of it, I picture long nights spent with satellite data watching landscapes change slowly over decades. Glaciers retreat, rivers shift, cities expand then hollow out. You begin to sense that stability is temporary, always borrowed, that what feels permanent is often just inertia. The Sumerians lived close to that understanding. Their cities rise quickly, flourish briefly, then are abandoned without spectacle. Life relocates nearby as if the ground itself remembers instability. New walls follow old orientations. New temples echo old footprints. Continuity is honoured, but replacement is cautious. The forgotten epoch becomes a shadow standard, something against which the present is measured even if it cannot be described. This shadow explains the emotional tone of the texts. There is reverence, but also anxiety. A sense that the present world is thinner than it once was, less forgiving, less spacious. The gods feel more distant, the margin for error smaller. In astronomy, we know that early stars were massive, bright, short-lived. Later stars are smaller, longer-lasting, more stable. The universe itself ages toward restraint. Sumerian mythology mirrors this cosmic pattern. Early figures burn intensely. Later generations persist quietly. Civilization in this view is not ascent, it is cooling. The forgotten epoch may not be a single civilization. It may be a mode of existence, a time when boundaries between human and divine nature and order were less sharply drawn. When memory was carried in experience rather than in inscription. When writing was unnecessary because continuity was embodied. When that continuity fractured, something had to replace it. Writing emerged, administration expanded, ritual hardened, memory externalized into claystone and schedule. The forgotten epoch disappears precisely because writing begins after it. This is important. Writing does not capture beginnings, it captures endings. It appears when something can no longer be held naturally, when memory must be stored artificially because the conditions that sustained it have changed. The Sumerian tablets may therefore mark not the birth of civilization, but the moment civilization realized it could forget. That realization is profound. It shifts the relationship to time entirely. The past is no longer secure. The future is no longer guaranteed. The present becomes a narrow bridge between erosion and silence. In such a world, origins lose urgency. They belong to a phase that cannot be restored. What matters is not where one came from, but how carefully one moves now. This attitude is deeply scientific. It resembles how we treat extinct species. We study them, we respect them, but we do not expect them to return. We adapt to the world that remains. The Sumerians adapted. Their silence around beginnings is not denial. It is acceptance of irreversibility. Certain thresholds once crossed cannot be uncrossed. Floods reshape landscapes permanently. Climate shifts redraw habitable zones. Social collapse alters consciousness itself. The forgotten epoch exists beyond those thresholds. Occasionally it flickers through myth. A place like Dilmun where sickness does not exist and death is unknown. But even this place is not presented as a home to return to. It is a reference point, a contrast, a reminder of the difference, not a destination. This restraint is striking. Many cultures turn lost epochs into promises. Sumer does not. It treats the past as heavier, not better. Closer to power, but also closer to danger. That balance informs everything. Late at night, when the world quiets and only distant sounds remain, you sometimes feel this same sensation. The sense that the past was larger, louder, more intense, and that the present, though smaller, is more survivable. Less radiant perhaps, but steadier. The forgotten epoch becomes something you acknowledge without chasing. Somewhere beyond our reach, something ancient still moves. But it does not call to be recovered. It reminds us to tread carefully. In the end, listener, the forgotten epoch is not a missing chapter. It is a boundary. A reminder that civilization may not begin with hope, but with adjustment. With learning how to live after something has already ended. And tonight, as the universe whispers again, it is enough to let that older world remain where it is. Silence too has its place. The absence of a true beginning in the Sumerian record becomes more intelligible when examined alongside the idea of reset rather than origin. The text's myths and administrative practices do not behave like the expressions of a civilization discovering itself for the first time. Instead, they resemble the output of a society rebuilding within limits imposed by earlier disruption. Civilization appears not as a continuous ascent, but as a recalibrated state that follows reduction. Across Mesopotamian literature, catastrophe is framed not as annihilation, but as correction. Flood narratives do not describe a new world emerging from nothing. They depict an already populated, already organized world being narrowed. Humanity exists before the flood. Cities exist, institutions function. The event does not create civilization, it compresses it. Afterward, life resumes under stricter parameters. Lifespans shorten, authority becomes more conditional, access to the divine grows more mediated. The system continues but diminished. This logic is consistent with how complex systems behave after collapse. In ecology, post-collapse environments tend to simplify. Diversity decreases. Energy flows stabilize. Redundancy is reduced. What remains is less expansive but more resilient. The Sumerian world exhibits similar traits. Early mythic figures are expansive and long-lived. Later historical figures operate within narrower ranges of possibility. The trajectory is not progress toward perfection, but adaptation to constraint. The reset model also explains the striking conservatism of Sumerian culture. Once stability is regained after disruption, deviation becomes dangerous. Innovation is not eliminated, but it is carefully controlled. Changes are framed as restorations rather than departures. New kings claim to rebuild according to ancient plans. New temples follow established footprints. Authority derives legitimacy not from novelty, but from alignment with inherited order. Writing itself fits this pattern. The earliest texts are administrative because administration is essential in a post-reset environment. When oral continuity fails, written continuity compensates. Writing emerges not to explore ideas, but to prevent drift. Fields must be counted accurately. Labour must be allocated precisely. Offerings must be tracked. Error carries existential risk. Documentation becomes a technology of survival. This urgency undermines the usefulness of origin stories. Narratives of beginnings invite speculation. Speculation opens alternative possibilities. Alternative possibilities destabilize authority. In a society operating under constraint, such openness is a liability. Silence around origins is therefore functional. It protects cohesion by limiting interpretive freedom at the foundation. The reset perspective also clarifies the tone of Sumerian myth. Creation stories lack wonder and celebration. Humanity is introduced as a solution to a labour imbalance among the gods. Existence begins with obligation rather than freedom. Civilization is immediately embedded in hierarchy and regulation. This is not the language of a first dawn. It is the language of a system already burdened by experience. Even divine authority reflects post-reset logic. Gods do not behave as limitless creators. They administer roles, enforce boundaries, and withdraw support when imbalance grows excessive. Their conflicts are procedural rather than existential. The cosmos they govern feels managed rather than imagined. Creation is less important than maintenance. Archaeology reinforces this reading. Urbanization in southern Mesopotamia accelerates rapidly, but within highly standardized forms. Settlement patterns repeat. Temple architecture adheres to canonical ratios. Administrative tools spread quickly across regions. This speed suggests not prolonged experimentation, but rapid formalization. Formalization is characteristic of societies attempting to stabilize inherited practices before they disappear. Environmental context strengthens the argument. Mesopotamia is ecologically volatile. Rivers shift unpredictably. Floods erase infrastructure without warning. Soil salinization undermines agriculture silently. Entire cities are abandoned and rebuilt nearby rather than restored in place. Such instability encourages defensive organization. Systems are simplified, standardized, and closely monitored. Complexity is tolerated only where it can be controlled. Within this environment, the concept of reset becomes not speculative but practical. Civilization survives by narrowing its operational bandwidth. Excess population is reduced. Excess noise is quieted. Excess deviation is corrected. The flood myths articulate this logic explicitly. Reduction is presented not as tragedy alone, but as necessity. The world continues because it becomes smaller. This worldview reshapes historical consciousness. Time is not oriented toward growth, but toward endurance. The past is heavier than the present, closer to power, but also closer to danger. The future offers no guarantee of improvement, only the possibility of continued alignment. Within such a framework, beginnings lose explanatory value. What matters is not how order emerged, but whether it can be sustained. The reset model also accounts for the emotional restraint of the texts. There is grief, but it is formalized. There is fear, but it is disciplined. There is reverence, but little triumph. This emotional economy is typical of cultures shaped by repeated disruption. Excess feeling threatens coherence. Composure becomes protective. Silence in this context is not ignorance, it is compression. It is what remains after experience has narrowed what can be safely carried forward. Origins belong to a phase of existence that no longer applies. Attempting to narrate them risks importing obsolete logic into a fragile present. The Sumerian record therefore speaks from after something rather than before it. Civilization is treated as conditional lent rather than owned. Order can be withdrawn, cities can be emptied, names can vanish. This awareness permeates prayers, laments, and legal codes. Responsibility is heavy because continuation is not assured. Seen this way, the absence of a true beginning is not a failure of memory, it is evidence of adaptation. A civilization that has survived reduction learns where to place its attention. It invests in measurement, repetition, and restraint. It avoids speculative foundations. It builds inward rather than outward. The reset does not need to be imagined as a single global catastrophe or lost supercivilization. It can be understood as cumulative disruption. Floods, migrations, ecological shifts, and social collapses layered across generations until continuity itself became uncertain. Writing appears at that threshold when memory must be externalized to survive. In this light, the Sumerian tablets do not mark the dawn of civilization. They mark the moment civilization realized it could end. What follows is not exuberant creation, but disciplined persistence. The record is shaped by that realization. It preserves what can be carried forward and allows the rest to fade. This silence around beginnings is therefore one of the most revealing features of the Sumerian world. It reflects a society oriented toward survival rather than explanation, toward maintenance rather than myth-making. Civilization is not celebrated as a triumph over chaos, but managed as a narrow condition, sustained against forces that do not yield to understanding. What remains is not a story of how civilization began, but a method by which it continued after being reduced. The Sumerian record stands as a testament to endurance under constraint, a voice speaking from within a long aftermath, rather than at the moment of origin. The implications of this interpretation extend beyond Sumer itself, and into how early civilization is defined more broadly. If the first written societies emerge not at the moment of origin, but at a moment of stabilization after disruption, then writing becomes a symptom of vulnerability rather than confidence. Literacy appears when memory alone is no longer sufficient, when continuity can no longer be trusted to pass unbroken through living generations. This perspective helps explain why writing emerges independently in multiple regions, after periods of environmental stress or social reorganization. In Mesopotamia, it follows climatic instability and rapid urban concentration. In Egypt, it appears alongside centralized state formation after prolonged Nile fluctuations. In the Indus Valley complex, urban systems arise fully formed, accompanied by standardized weights and symbols, yet with little overt celebration of invention. In each case, writing coincides with consolidation, not genesis. The role of administration becomes central. Early civilizations are not obsessed with explaining the cosmos, but with regulating it. Their earliest texts are not philosophical reflections, but operational documents. This suggests that the primary challenge they faced was not understanding the world, but coordinating human activity within it, under conditions of uncertainty. Administration replaces myth as the stabilizing force. This administrative mindset reshapes social hierarchy. Authority is justified not by creativity or charisma, but by reliability. Kingship is framed as an office rather than a personal achievement. Rulers inherit legitimacy by maintaining order, not by founding it. This explains why Sumerian kings rarely claim to invent institutions. They present themselves as restorers, caretakers, or executors of divine mandates that pre-exist them. The same logic governs law. Legal codes do not read like experimental frameworks. They assume long-standing norms and focus on consistency. Punishments are standardized. Transactions are formalized. Disputes are resolved by reference to precedent rather than innovation. Law functions as a memory device, preserving expected behavior when social cohesion is fragile. This fragility also informs Sumerian attitudes toward knowledge. Knowledge is not framed as open-ended inquiry. It is compartmentalized. Specialized roles emerge: scribes, priests, diviners, astronomers. Access is limited. Transmission is controlled. Knowledge is powerful because it stabilizes order, and therefore it must be protected from misuse or dilution. Such control is incompatible with open narratives of origin. Origin stories invite reinterpretation. They allow competing claims to legitimacy. They encourage alternative cosmologies. In a post-reset environment where cohesion is paramount, this openness is destabilizing. Silence becomes a form of governance. Even when earlier states of existence are referenced, they are abstracted. Long lifespans, divine proximity, and primordial abundance are described without concrete detail. These references function less as history and more as contrast. They define the present by what it is not. The past is larger but also uncontrollable. The present is smaller but governable. This pattern suggests that early civilization is less concerned with remembering the past accurately than with preventing its recurrence. Catastrophe is acknowledged but not anatomized. The causes are attributed to imbalance, excess, or divine withdrawal rather than specific mechanisms. This abstraction avoids fixation. It prevents societies from attempting to recreate conditions that led to collapse. Archaeological evidence aligns with this caution. After major disruptions, societies rarely rebuild exactly as before. They simplify, they reduce scale, they adjust settlement patterns, they alter subsistence strategies. The Sumerian landscape shows repeated cycles of abandonment and reoccupation, with each iteration refining administrative techniques rather than architectural ambition. This refinement produces an illusion of sudden sophistication. When a society rebuilds using inherited templates, the result appears abrupt to outside observers. The learning curve has already occurred elsewhere earlier or under different conditions. What survives is not the process, but the form. This challenges linear models of civilizational progress. Instead of gradual accumulation, early history may involve repeated contractions followed by rapid reorganization. Each cycle preserves certain structures while discarding others. Writing crystallizes at the point where preservation becomes conscious. The silence around beginnings thus functions as a boundary marker. It signals a transition from organic continuity to managed continuity. Before the boundary memory flows naturally through lived experience, after it memory must be fixed, archived, and forced. Writing is the tool that makes this possible. This transition has psychological consequences. A society aware of its fragility develops a restrained worldview. Excess emotion is moderated, ambition is ritualized, curiosity is bounded, the cosmos is perceived as ordered but conditional. Stability depends on compliance rather than exploration. Such a worldview contrasts sharply with later philosophical traditions that treat inquiry as virtue. In early Mesopotamia, inquiry is subordinate to maintenance, asking why matters less than ensuring that systems function as expected. This does not indicate intellectual deficiency. It indicates a different priority shaped by historical pressure. Over time, this priority becomes embedded in culture. Education trains scribes to replicate forms precisely. Deviations are errors, not innovations. Art adheres to canonical proportions. Music follows established modes. Creativity exists, but it operates within narrow corridors. The result is a civilization that appears static from a modern perspective, but is in fact dynamically stable. Its success lies in persistence rather than transformation. It survives because it resists change that could reintroduce instability. This stability, however, carries its own cost. When environments shift beyond the tolerances of established systems, adaptation becomes difficult. The same conservatism that protects continuity can inhibit flexibility. This may explain why Sumerian city-states eventually decline despite their administrative sophistication. Systems optimized for one set of constraints struggle when those constraints change, yet even decline follows familiar patterns. Cities are not violently destroyed in most cases. They are abandoned, people relocate, administrative knowledge disperses into successor cultures. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian societies inherit Sumerian frameworks rather than replacing them. Language fades, but structure persists. This persistence reinforces the idea that what mattered most was not the origin of civilization, but the techniques that allowed it to endure. The Sumerians did not need to explain where their systems came from, because those systems continued to function long after their creators were gone. From this perspective, the silence around beginnings becomes a marker of success rather than deficiency. It indicates that civilization had already passed through its most volatile phase. What remained was a narrow but navigable channel through time. The Sumerian record therefore invites a reassessment of what it means to begin. A beginning may not be the moment something appears, but the moment it becomes fragile enough to require preservation. Writing marks that moment. It freezes a world that can no longer rely on lived continuity alone. Seen this way, the earliest tablets do not open history. They interrupt it. They cut into an ongoing process to hold something in place. They preserve order not because it is new, but because it is threatened. This reframing dissolves the expectation of a clear starting line. Civilization does not announce itself, it stabilizes itself. The first records reflect this stabilization, not the chaos that preceded it. What survives into history then is not the origin of civilization, but the memory of its vulnerability. The Sumerian tablets speak quietly but persistently from within that awareness. They document a world that knows it can be lost. In that knowledge lies their power. Not as chronicles of a beginning, but as evidence of a civilization that learned perhaps earlier than most that continuity is not guaranteed. Civilization exists not because it began once, but because it continues to be held together against forces that do not care whether it survives. That recognition, more than any myth of origin, defines the true starting point of recorded human history. The long-term consequence of this posture is that history itself becomes selective. What is recorded is not what explains the past, but what protects the present. Over generations, this selectivity hardens into tradition. By the time later cultures encounter the Sumerian record, the silences are already ancient, no longer perceived as omissions, but as natural limits of knowledge. This has important implications for how modern scholarship interprets early civilizations. When historians search for beginnings in the earliest texts, they assume that the act of writing coincides with the desire to explain origins. The Sumerian material suggests otherwise. Writing emerges alongside the need to constrain behavior, standardize expectations, and reduce uncertainty. It is a response to instability, not curiosity. This distinction helps resolve a persistent tension in early history, the mismatch between archaeological sophistication and narrative simplicity. Complex cities appear suddenly, but the stories that accompany them are sparse, repetitive, and procedural. This is not a failure of imagination. It is evidence of a culture that prioritized coherence over expression. As administrative systems expand, they reshape collective memory. Events that threaten order are abstracted. Causes are simplified. Responsibility is displaced onto cosmic balance rather than human decision-making. This reduces conflict and limits reinterpretation. Memory becomes less descriptive and more functional, designed to guide behavior rather than preserve detail. Over time, this functional memory replaces experiential memory entirely. Later generations inherit rules without context. Rituals are performed because they are correct, not because their origins are understood. Authority persists because it works, not because it can be justified historically. Civilization becomes self-referential, maintaining itself through repetition. This process is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears wherever societies experience repeated disruption followed by consolidation. After enough cycles, explanation gives way to enforcement. Stability becomes the primary value. The past is no longer a source of meaning, but a risk factor. In such systems, the idea of a beginning becomes almost irrelevant. Beginnings imply contingency. They suggest that things could have unfolded differently. For societies operating under the constant threat of collapse, this implication is destabilizing. It opens space for alternative arrangements, competing authorities, and renewed experimentation. Silence around origins prevents this destabilization. The Sumerian case therefore forces a reconsideration of how historical consciousness develops. Rather than emerging from a desire to remember, it may emerge from a fear of forgetting. What survives into writing is not the richness of lived experience, but the minimum structure required to prevent disintegration. This also reframes the relationship between myth and history. Myths are often treated as primitive attempts to explain the world. In early Mesopotamia, myth functions more like regulation. It encodes limits. It warns against excess. It explains not how the world began, but why restraint is necessary. The gods themselves embody this logic. They are not aspirational figures encouraging growth or transcendence. They enforce boundaries. They punish imbalance. They withdraw support when thresholds are crossed. Their narratives teach caution, not ambition. The moral universe is not open-ended. It is conditional. This conditional worldview aligns closely with the realities of the environment. Mesopotamia does not reward long-term optimism. Its rivers are unpredictable. Its soil degrades silently. Its climate shifts without warning. Under such conditions, a worldview oriented toward preservation is rational. It reduces exposure to risk. The cost of this rationality is historical depth. As generations pass, the reasons behind institutions fade. What remains is form without context. Writing preserves structure but not origin. Over centuries, this produces the impression that civilization appeared fully formed when in fact it has been stripped of its developmental layers. This stripping is not accidental. It's the result of continuous compression. Each cycle of disruption removes elements that cannot be easily stabilized. What survives is what can be repeated reliably. Over time, repetition becomes tradition, and tradition becomes identity. Modern readers encounter this compressed identity and mistake it for completeness. The absence of origin stories is interpreted as lost material rather than deliberate omission. The sophistication of early systems is attributed to sudden innovation rather than inherited constraint. The result is a distorted picture of early civilization as both miraculous and inexplicable. When viewed through the lens of reset and stabilization, this distortion dissolves. Civilization no longer appears as an anomaly that emerged suddenly from nothing. It appears as a process of survival under pressure shaped by repeated loss and careful reconstruction. This perspective also challenges the notion that progress is the primary driver of history. In early Mesopotamia, continuity mattered more than advancement. The goal was not to surpass the past, but to avoid repeating its failures. Innovation was acceptable only when it could be framed as restoration. Such a framework produces civilizations that are highly resilient in familiar conditions but vulnerable to unfamiliar change. When environmental or political pressures shift beyond established parameters, adaptation becomes difficult. Systems optimized for stability resist transformation. This may explain why later Mesopotamian societies rise and fall while retaining similar administrative cores. The language changes, the gods are renamed, political power shifts, but the underlying logic of regulation persists. Civilization survives by conserving structure even as surface forms erode. In this sense, the Sumerian record represents a turning point not because it marks the beginning of civilization, but because it marks the beginning of conscious preservation. Humanity becomes aware that its systems can fail and responds by fixing them in place. Writing is the tool that enables this fixation. It freezes relationships. It standardizes memory. It transforms lived practices into durable instructions. What it does not preserve is the open-endedness of earlier phases where systems were still forming organically. This loss of open-endedness is the price of survival. Civilization becomes something that must be managed rather than discovered. History becomes something that must be curated rather than explored. The silence around beginnings is therefore not a mystery to be solved, but a signal to be interpreted. It indicates a shift in human self-understanding. A recognition that existence is fragile, that order is temporary, and that memory must be guarded carefully. What emerges from this shift is not a narrative of creation, but a discipline of continuation. The Sumerian tablets document a world that has learned to live within limits, to value alignment over explanation, and to accept that some knowledge belongs to a phase of existence that cannot be safely revisited. In this light, the earliest records do not ask us to look backward toward a lost dawn. They ask us to look inward toward the conditions that make civilization possible at all. They speak from within a long aftermath, reminding us that what we call history may begin not with hope, but with restraint. That restraint, quietly encoded in clay and silence, may be the most enduring legacy of the first recorded civilizations. The next layer that becomes visible is the way authority is remembered and transmitted once explanation has been set aside. Power in the Sumerian record does not originate in human action, it descends. Kings do not found order, they receive it. This distinction matters because it removes agency from the question of beginnings. If authority is always granted rather than created, then its first appearance lies outside human memory. The earliest rulers are not portrayed as innovators or visionaries. They reign, they maintain, they restore. Their legitimacy depends on alignment with something older than themselves. This orientation shapes the entire political imagination. Kingship is conditional and revocable. A ruler governs only as long as balance is preserved. When balance fails, authority withdraws without explanation. The record does not debate whether this withdrawal is just. It records that it happened. Power is treated less as a possession than as a current that flows through proper channels and dries up when those channels are misaligned. In such a system, tracing origins would add little. What matters is whether authority is currently present, not how it first arrived. This same logic extends into social structure. Occupational roles appear early and remain remarkably stable. Priests, scribes, labourers, artisans, and administrators populate the texts with defined functions. Social mobility exists but is limited. The system does not invite reconfiguration, it demands participation. These roles are not justified through narrative. They are assumed. Their persistence suggests that society understands itself as operating within a pre-established blueprint, rather than constructing itself anew. Because roles are inherited rather than invented, deviation carries weight. Innovation is not celebrated unless it can be framed as recovery of an earlier, truer form. Change must disguise itself as return. This produces a culture that moves slowly, cautiously, and with deep respect for precedent. The past functions as an authority even when its details are no longer accessible. What remains is form without explanation. This posture creates a particular emotional climate. Stability brings security, but it also fosters anxiety. If order depends on precise alignment with inherited patterns, then error becomes existential. A misstep does not merely fail, it threatens collapse. This anxiety surfaces repeatedly in the constant appeal to divine oversight. Decisions are witnessed by gods, treaties are sealed before cosmic authority, rituals are performed with exactness because correctness itself is protective. The gods in this system reinforce restraint rather than liberation. They regulate boundaries, they distribute functions, they withhold as much as they grant. Even when they intervene dramatically, their actions restore limits rather than expand possibility. Excess noise leads to reduction. Excess population leads to correction. Catastrophe is not framed as moral outrage, but as recalibration. This reinforces the idea that civilization exists within fixed parameters it did not define. Within such a framework, the notion of a singular beginning becomes disruptive. A beginning implies a moment of freedom, of unstructured possibility of authorship. The Sumerian worldview leaves little room for such a moment. Structure appears primordial. Order precedes memory. Humanity enters an already functioning system and learns to operate within it. To ask how the system began is to ask a question without operational value. This perspective reshapes how creation myths function. In later traditions, creation explains purpose and direction. In early Mesopotamia, creation accounts often explain obligation. Humanity exists because work must be done. Order must be maintained. Labour is assigned. Existence itself carries responsibility rather than privilege. The tone is transactional, not celebratory. Life begins already embedded in hierarchy. The absence of heroic origin narratives follows naturally from this tone. There is no language of liberation, no story of ascent from chaos into mastery. Civilization unfolds as duty rather than aspiration. Even rebellion, when it appears, is contained and ritualized. Disorder is not an alternative vision, it is a deviation to be corrected. The system does not imagine itself becoming something else. This has consequences for how time is understood. Time contracts rather than expands. Lifespans shorten. Authority becomes more procedural. Direct contact with the divine recedes into mediated signs. The direction of history moves toward constraint, not fulfillment. This contraction is accepted rather than resisted. The record does not argue against it. It adapts. Writing plays a critical role in this adaptation. As immediacy fades, memory must be externalized. Clay tablets replace lived continuity. List measurements and procedures preserve what can no longer be held directly. Writing does not celebrate arrival. It compensates for loss. It anchors systems that would otherwise drift. This anchoring transforms knowledge itself. Knowledge becomes bounded. It is curated rather than expanded. Certain forms of understanding are restricted to specialists. Secrets are guarded. Revelation is controlled. This control reflects an awareness that knowledge can destabilize as easily as it can empower. Too much knowledge or knowledge held improperly risks imbalance. Silence becomes a tool. Not every truth is preserved. Not every memory is carried forward. What endures is what supports alignment. Over generations, this selective preservation hardens into tradition. What was once restraint becomes habit. What was once caution becomes identity. The result is a record heavy with procedure and light on explanation. Modern readers often experience this as frustration. The absence of origins feels like a missing piece. But within its own context, the record is coherent. It does not aim to satisfy curiosity. It aims to prevent collapse. Archaeology reinforces this reading. Cultural layers accumulate without clear transitions. Cities are abandoned and reoccupied nearby. Systems persist even as populations shift. The material record shows continuity, punctuated by disruption, not clean emergence. Civilization appears repeatedly midstream, already structured, already constrained. When new technologies appear, they integrate seamlessly into existing frameworks. Writing supports administration already in place. Metallurgy refines tools already used. Innovation enhances function but does not redefine purpose. Progress is incremental and cautious. The system improves by refinement, not by reinvention. This orientation explains why later cultures struggle to extract beginnings from the Sumerian material. The texts were never designed to provide them. They were written for continuity, not explanation. Their audience was internal. They addressed those responsible for maintaining balance, not those seeking historical clarity. The absence of beginnings is therefore not a flaw. It is an expression of maturity shaped by experience. A civilization that has endured repeated disruption learns where to place its attention. Origins do not sustain the present. Practices do. What survives is a posture rather than a narrative, a posture of restraint, repetition, and careful alignment. Civilization is not justified through story. It is enacted through discipline. The record does not ask how order came to be. It shows how order is kept. Seen this way, the Sumerian silence becomes meaningful. It marks a boundary between what can be safely remembered and what cannot. Beyond that boundary lies a past too charged, too disruptive, or too incompatible with present survival to be carried forward intact. Silence preserves stability. The legacy of this choice is profound. It produces a civilization that does not anchor itself in a mythic beginning, but in an ongoing practice. Identity is not derived from origin, but from correct participation. Belonging is enacted rather than narrated. In this sense, the Sumerian record does not fail to tell a story of beginnings. It tells a different story, entirely one about endurance after loss, about living within limits, and about the disciplined refusal to speculate where speculation offers no protection. Another dimension of this restraint becomes visible in the way catastrophe is remembered without being anatomized. Destruction is acknowledged, even mourned, but its deeper causes are left deliberately opaque. Lamentations composed after the fall of cities describe emptied temples, departing gods, streets filled with silence, and names slipping out of use. The emotional force is unmistakable, yet explanation stops short. Collapse is attributed to withdrawal of favour or shift in destiny, not to a chain of causes that might be debated or corrected. The event is accepted as real, devastating, and final, but not dissected. This pattern suggests a learned caution. To analyse catastrophe too deeply would imply that it could have been prevented through alternative choices or that the cosmic order itself is flawed. Either implication threatens stability, acceptance becomes safer than inquiry. Grief is permitted, speculation is not. The record teaches how to endure loss without destabilizing the structures that remain. The flood narratives sharpen this logic. They gesture toward total rupture, a moment when the world is nearly erased. Yet even here the emphasis is not on mechanism. Noise grows excessive, balance fails, reduction follows. Afterward, civilization resumes with tightened constraints, lifespans shorten, authority becomes more regulated, mortality is fixed. The flood does not inaugurate freedom or renewal, it imposes limits. Survival continues diminished. This motif of reduction recurs across texts. Earlier figures live longer, later ones do not. Direct contact with the divine recedes. Knowledge becomes mediated through ritual and record. The direction of time moves toward narrowing rather than expansion. This contraction is never framed as injustice. It is treated as condition. Civilization adapts rather than protests. Archaeology mirrors this narrative. Early phases show diversity of form and experimentation. Later phases consolidate, standardize, and repeat. Variety yields to uniformity. Flexibility gives way to control. This is often interpreted as maturation, but it can also be read as adaptation to trauma. After disruption, systems harden. Risk is minimized, memory is simplified. What remains must function reliably. In such an environment, origins lose practical value. They belong to a phase of abundance and openness that no longer applies. To dwell on beginnings would be to dwell on a mode of existence incompatible with survival. The record looks away from that temptation and focuses on what remains actionable. Writing itself appears within this context. It emerges not as celebration but as necessity. When oral continuity breaks, writing compensates. When memory fragments, tablets stabilize. The earliest texts are administrative because administration is urgent. Fields must be measured. Labour must be assigned, offerings must be recorded. Accuracy sustains life. Reflection does not. Over time, these urgent records accumulate into an archive that later readers mistake for a beginning, but the archive never claims to be one. It is a ledger of continuity. It preserves procedures, not origins. It records how to function within a narrowed world. This functional orientation shapes how truth is handled. Truth is not abstract. It is bounded by what can be integrated without harm. The record preserves enough truth to sustain order, not enough to destabilize it. Silence becomes an ethical choice rather than a failure of memory. This perspective reframes the absence of beginnings yet again. The omission may reflect care. Certain truths, even if once known, may have been judged too disruptive to preserve explicitly. Over generations, what is not copied disappears. Selection becomes tradition. The scribes who chose what to transmit shaped the record through institutional priorities rather than neutral curiosity. As a result, the corpus grows heavy with ritual law and administration. Speculative material fades. Civilization is presented as a given condition rather than a question. Yet traces of deeper memory remain. They surface indirectly in myths of reduction, in references to earlier intimacy with the divine, in lists that begin mid-sequence. These traces suggest awareness without articulation. The culture lived with a sense that something essential lay behind it, inaccessible but influential. This sense did not provoke reconstruction, it provoked reverence and restraint. The emotional texture that emerges is distinctive. There is grief, but it is contained. There is longing, but it is brief. Nostalgia is absent. Loss is acknowledged without promise of recovery. Reconstruction occurs but on altered terms. The altered becomes normal. Within this normality, civilization internalizes loss as structure. Memory includes absence. The future is imagined not as return to fullness but as continuation under constraint. The highest good becomes preservation of balance, not recovery of what was lost. This orientation clarifies why beginnings remain silent. Beginnings promise more than the present can sustain. They invite energies no longer safe. The record therefore centers on what can still be done. Measurement, ritual, alignment. These acts keep the narrowed world intact. What survives is not an explanation but a discipline, a way of living with limits of maintaining order without illusion of permanence. In this discipline, the silence around origins is not emptiness, it is the shape of survival. What ultimately endures in the Sumerian record is not certainty but restraint. Civilization appears not as a triumphant emergence but as a condition already shaped by wear, loss and repetition. The earliest texts speak from within an established world, one that assumes order rather than explains it. This assumption is not naivete. It reflects a deep awareness that explanation does not guarantee survival. Throughout the record, restraint operates as an organizing principle. Knowledge is transmitted carefully bounded by ritual and precedent. Authority is exercised conditionally, always dependent on alignment rather than innovation. Memory is preserved selectively with priority given to what stabilizes daily life. The result is a civilization that resists speculation, where speculation offers no practical benefit. This restraint becomes most visible in what is not said. There is no narrative of first invention, no myth of society, rising from chaos through human ingenuity. Instead, there is continuity without genesis. Lists begin in the middle. Institutions appear already formed. The world is treated as something inherited, not constructed. Such treatment suggests a society acutely aware that it lives after disruption, rather than before achievement. The emotional tone that accompanies this worldview is subtle but persistent. Anxiety exists, but it is disciplined. Grief appears, but it does not demand explanation. The fall of cities is mourned without inquiry into ultimate causes. Acceptance replaces analysis. This posture may appear passive from a modern perspective, but within its context it represents a survival strategy. Excessive questioning risks unraveling systems that have already proven fragile. Civilization in this light becomes an ongoing test rather than a completed accomplishment. Each generation inherits a framework that must be maintained with care. Failure is not dramatic, it is quiet. Order slips when alignment falters. The threat is not sudden collapse but gradual erosion. This awareness shapes the record's tone. It is careful inward-looking and resistant to grand claims. The absence of beginnings thus functions as a stabilizing silence. It prevents fixation on what can no longer be recovered. It anchors attention in the present task, sustaining balance within constraint. The past beyond this boundary remains acknowledged but unreachable. It is honoured through repetition rather than reconstructed through narrative. This approach to memory contrasts sharply with later historical traditions that emphasize origin, progress, and destiny. The Sumerian record offers no such arc. It neither promises redemption nor celebrates ascent. It remains focused on endurance. Civilization persists because it learns where not to speak, where not to inquire, and where not to imagine freely. In the end, the record leaves behind not an answer, but a posture, a way of standing within time that values continuity over comprehension. The silence around beginnings becomes meaningful precisely because it reflects a civilization that understood its own vulnerability. What it preserved was not the story of how it began, but the discipline that allowed it to continue quietly within a world that had already shown how easily it could be undone. Another layer of meaning emerges when attention turns to how time itself is handled within the Sumerian record. Time is not treated as an open horizon moving toward improvement, nor as a narrative arc with a clear origin and destination. It is approached as a medium that requires constant calibration. Days, months, reigns, and cycles are counted with precision, yet this precision does not express optimism, it expresses vigilance. Time is something that can drift out of alignment if not carefully measured. Calendrical systems appear early and already complex. Festivals recur at fixed intervals. Agricultural tasks are synchronized with celestial movements. The sky is observed not as a realm of mystery inviting speculation, but as a regulator whose regularity must be consulted. Stars mark time. They do not promise transcendence. This relationship with the heavens reinforces the broader silence around beginnings. In a cyclical conception of time, origins dissolve into recurrence. What matters is not when something first happened, but whether it continues to happen correctly. Ritual embodies this logic. The new year does not celebrate a first moment. It restores balance. Ceremonies reenact order so that time does not wander too far from its template. Even historical time is handled cautiously. Year names commemorate events, but these events are administrative, religious, or corrective. They mark restorations, offerings, constructions, and judgments. Innovation for its own sake is rarely commemorated. Time is catalogued through acts of maintenance. Within this framework, longevity itself is interpreted as something that diminishes rather than increases. Early figures in the record live extraordinarily long lives. Later ones do not. This contraction is not explained. It is accepted. The direction of time is downward, not upward. Civilization moves away from fullness toward limitation. The emotional texture of the literature reflects this orientation. The past is heavier, closer to the divine, more potent. The present is narrower, more regulated. The future is uncertain and conditional. Writing arises within this narrowing. It functions as a technology of resistance against erosion. Clay tablets do not stop time, but they slow forgetting. What cannot be preserved in lived continuity is preserved in material form. This explains the early dominance of accounting lists and administrative records. Accounting externalizes memory. It replaces reliance on shared presence with documentation. When societies feel stable, memory circulates informally. When stability weakens, records multiply. The explosion of documentation in early Mesopotamia signals anxiety rather than confidence. Law follows the same pattern. Legal codes codify expectations so that memory cannot distort them. Justice becomes a matter of reference rather than negotiation. The law remembers so that individuals do not have to. Yet codification carries a cost. Flexibility diminishes. Adaptation slows. Civilization grows heavy with its own mechanisms of preservation. This weight contributes to the subdued tone of the texts. There is little exuberance. Even praise is measured. Emotion is contained within form. The gods mirror this containment. They are powerful but constrained by roles. Authority is distributed across domains. Conflict occurs but resolves into structure. The universe is not chaotic, it is procedural. Within such a universe, beginnings lose narrative appeal. The bureaucracy is already in place, forms already exist. What matters is whether they continue to function. Each generation receives a burden and passes it on. This burden includes knowledge, ritual measurement, and memory. It also includes silence where memory no longer reaches. This silence is not empty. It exerts pressure. It shapes behavior. The awareness that something fundamental lies beyond reach produces caution. One does not invent freely when one suspects that the past contained answers no longer accessible. This reluctance to describe beginnings may therefore reflect respect rather than ignorance. To speak inaccurately about origins would risk misalignment. Silence preserves coherence. Over time, this restraint becomes customary. What is not said gains authority through repetition. The absence itself becomes part of the inherited structure. Archaeology again supports this reading. Cultural layers accumulate without clear breaks. Phases blur into one another. Even when new technologies appear, they integrate smoothly into existing systems. Writing supports administration already in place. Metallurgy enhances tools already used. The narrative is one of refinement rather than invention. Progress is incremental and cautious. The question of who first organized society or founded cities becomes irrelevant within this logic. The task is to keep the system functioning. Memory becomes selective and pragmatic. Procedures are remembered, origins are not. Over centuries, this selectivity solidifies into worldview. Civilization is no longer imagined as something that began. It is imagined as something that must be maintained. Later cultures encountering this record often attempt to extract beginnings from it. They search for first kings, first laws, first cities. The record resists these efforts because it was never designed for them. It was written for continuity, not explanation. Its audience was internal. The next generation tasked with preserving balance, not distant observers seeking narrative clarity. The absence of a beginning thus becomes an expression of maturity shaped by risk. Civilization has endured enough disruption to know that origins do not guarantee survival. Discipline does. The record looks inward toward preservation rather than outward toward creation. In doing so, it offers a distinct philosophy of history, one grounded not in assent but in endurance. As this inward-looking philosophy of endurance settles into focus, another implication becomes clear. Civilization in the Sumerian record is never assumed to be secure. It exists on a kind of probation sustained only as long as balance is maintained. Order is not permanent, it is lent. This idea appears repeatedly across hymns, prayers, and ritual texts, often without emphasis, as if it were self-evident. Cities are said to exist because divine presence remains within them. When that presence withdraws, the city becomes hollow even if its walls still stand. This conception alters the meaning of permanence. Stone and brick do not guarantee survival. Temples can be abandoned, streets can fall silent. What matters is not material continuity, but ongoing sanction from forces beyond human control. Civilization, therefore, is not anchored firmly to land or lineage. It is anchored to alignment. Such a worldview fosters constant attentiveness to signs of withdrawal. Omens, portents, and divinatory practices occupy a central role not as tools of curiosity, but as instruments of caution. Divination functions less as prediction than as early warning. It seeks subtle signals of misalignment before collapse becomes visible. Dreams, irregular celestial movements, unexpected patterns in sacrifice, or anomalies in ritual performance are treated as tremors preceding disaster. The prevalence of these practices suggests a society keenly aware that catastrophe rarely arrives without precursor. Civilization survives by listening closely rather than acting boldly. This listening is ethical rather than intellectual. It requires restraint, humility, and willingness to accept correction without full explanation. The gods do not debate, they signal. The human task is to respond accurately, not to demand clarity. Within this signalling, economy, origin, narratives offer little practical value. They provide no warning, no corrective instruction, no means of recalibration. They belong to a domain outside the operational logic of survival. Instead, attention remains fixed on thresholds. Moments where balance might tip. Boundaries where excess becomes dangerous. The flood myths illustrate this logic with particular clarity. Humanity grows too numerous, too noisy. The response is not reform but reduction. Afterward, stricter limits are imposed. The lesson is not moral improvement but recalibration. This principle recurs throughout Sumerian thought. When imbalance occurs, the solution is subtraction rather than transformation. Such subtraction implies a worldview that treats complexity as risk. Excess destabilizes. Simplicity stabilizes. Civilization thrives not by expanding endlessly, but by pruning itself. This pruning carries ethical weight. Restraint becomes virtue. Excess becomes dangerous not because it is immoral, but because it threatens continuity. Ethics align with survival rather than aspiration. Within such an ethic, beginnings lose significance. Beginnings imply expansion, openness, and unregulated potential. They belong to a phase no longer accessible or safe. The present demands control. Memory is curated accordingly. What supports recalibration is preserved. What invites speculative reinterpretation fades. Silence becomes functional. The gods themselves model this restraint. They are powerful but bounded. They do not create endlessly. They regulate. Even divine authority operates within inherited parameters. This mutual constraint reinforces the sense that the universe itself functions within limits no one authored from scratch. Everyone participates in maintenance. No one claims origination. Cosmology reflects this posture. The heavens are predictable. Their regularity allows alignment of calendars, rituals, and agriculture. Order is visible but not explained. The absence of explanation is not ignorance. It is acceptance. The system works. Its origin does not need articulation to function. Civilization resembles a mechanism whose builders are no longer present. The current inhabitants know how to operate it, repair parts of it, and recognize signs of malfunction. They do not know how it was built, and attempting to reconstruct its construction without adequate knowledge risks damage. This mechanical sensibility resonates with the bureaucratic tone of many texts. The universe runs on procedure. Gods assign roles. Humans fulfill tasks. Disruption occurs when procedures are neglected. Emphasis falls on execution rather than interpretation. Origins belong to a time of assembly, not maintenance. The present task is operation. Agency within this system is real but constrained. Humans can choose precision or neglect care or indifference. They cannot redefine the structure. Such limited agency fosters attentiveness without illusion of control. Action is careful because consequences may exceed understanding. This posture permeates prayer. Requests are tentative. Certainty is rare. Continued favour is sought, not entitlement. Entitlement would imply permanence, and permanence is never assumed. This awareness of withdrawability saturates the record with quiet tension. Every ritual inscription and reconstruction carries the implicit hope that it will be sufficient to keep order in place. The absence of origin stories fits seamlessly into this emotional climate. Origins imply stability. They suggest foundations that cannot be removed. The Sumerian worldview allows no such comfort. Environmental reality reinforces this stance. Rivers shift course, floods erase settlements, fields salinize. Geography itself resists permanence. Civilization adapts or relocates. Over time, this responsiveness becomes cultural reflex. Memory travels lightly, carrying only what is necessary to function. The record reflects this prioritization. It is light on beginnings, heavy on procedure. From a modern perspective, this restraint can appear evasive, yet within its context it represents a coherent survival logic. Origin knowledge does not strengthen alignment. It risks destabilizing inherited authority. Silence preserves hierarchy. Hierarchy preserves order. Order preserves survival. The logic is circular but stable. Across generations, this logic hardens into tradition. The absence of origin narratives no longer requires justification. It becomes normalized. Later cultures attempt to fill the silence with new stories, but the earliest layer remains untouched. It does not explain itself. It does not need to. Function becomes the measure of truth. What works endures. What does not fades. Origins, whatever they once were, did not serve the ongoing task. They were allowed to recede. This fading does not erase reverence. The past is honoured through preservation of form rather than reconstruction of story. The Sumerian record preserves order the way a vessel preserves water by shape, not by memory of how it was formed. The vessel does not narrate its creation. It holds. That act of holding, repeated across centuries, becomes the quiet achievement of the civilization. The cost of this achievement is silence. Certain questions remain unanswered. Certain memories remain inaccessible. The record accepts this cost. In doing so, it offers a vision of civilization not as an act of beginning, but as a discipline of remaining. As this discipline of remaining deepens, a quieter transformation becomes visible in the way human expectation itself is shaped. Civilization no longer imagines fulfillment as expansion or recovery of a lost fullness. Instead, it learns to live with less. Possibility narrows gradually, not through a single catastrophe, but through accumulated adjustment. Early figures are remembered as living longer, closer to divine presence. Later generations accept shorter lives, mediated rituals, and increasingly procedural authority. This contraction is not framed as injustice. It is treated as condition. What is striking is the absence of protest. Loss does not provoke rebellion against the structure of the world. It produces caution. The culture adapts its values accordingly. Grandeur gives way to reliability. Excess yields to balance. Ambition softens into endurance. The highest good becomes stability rather than achievement. Within such a value system, the question of how civilization began loses relevance. Beginnings belong to an age of abundance when horizons were wider and boundaries more flexible. That age is acknowledged only indirectly through hints of reduction and distance. Myth reinforces this lesson. Figures of strength and aspiration encounter limits they cannot cross. The most powerful heroes return not with transformation, but with understanding of boundaries. Their journeys do not reopen lost possibilities. They clarify what is no longer attainable. Wisdom becomes knowledge of where not to go. Civilization matures by learning which questions no longer serve survival. This maturity carries a subdued emotional tone. Sorrow is present but restrained. Longing appears but briefly. Nostalgia does not harden into narrative. Laments grieve destroyed cities and abandoned temples, yet they do not promise restoration to former completeness. Rebuilding occurs but on altered terms. The altered becomes normal. Loss is internalized as structure rather than exception. Once loss is internalized, memory itself changes function. It no longer seeks to recover everything. It seeks to preserve what allows continuation. Memory becomes selective, practical, disciplined. Explanations fade. procedures endure. Identity shifts from narrative to practice. One belongs by acting correctly, not by tracing descent from a mythical origin. Ritual replaces genealogy. Alignment replaces ancestry. This performative identity reshapes social cohesion. Shared actions matter more than shared stories. Cohesion is enacted repeatedly rather than justified once. The record reflects this priority. It preserves instructions rather than justifications, measurements rather than myths of invention. It tells how, not why. From a modern standpoint, this can feel incomplete. Within its own logic, it is sufficient. The silence around beginnings aligns with this sufficiency. To narrate origins would be to reopen horizons that no longer exist. It would invite reinterpretation in a world where reinterpretation carries risk. Stability depends on limits. Knowledge must stay within bounds. Power must stay within bounds. Memory must stay within bounds. Origins threaten these boundaries by introducing unregulated possibility. This boundedness extends even to hope. The future is not imagined as redemption or return. It is imagined as continuation under constraint. Calendars turn. Festivals repeat. Order is restored again and again, never perfected. Time loops rather than advances. In such a temporal structure, a beginning loses singular meaning. Cycles have no true start. They only recur. Repetition becomes reassurance. Predictability reduces anxiety. The emotional register of the civilization adjusts accordingly. Hope grows quieter. Fear becomes disciplined. Joy is formalized. Excess emotion is suspect. The voice of the record remains measured even when describing devastation. This composure is not indifference. It is protection. Emotional extremes threaten practice. Practice sustains life. Over centuries, this composure hardens into tradition. Silence around beginnings no longer feels like a mission. It becomes expectation. Later cultures may find the record austere, even evasive. Within its original context, it is coherent. It reflects a society that has learned where attention must remain focused in order to survive. The clay tablets embody this focus. They are steady, repetitive, and unadorned. They accumulate without narrative climax. Lists continue. Names repeat. Calendars cycle. There is no crescendo, no revelation, no definitive conclusion. Civilization does not culminate. It persists. The lack of a beginning mirrors the lack of an ending. Both would imply symmetry, closure, and certainty. The world view allows none of these. Instead, civilization occupies a narrow interval between loss and forgetting. It is held together by disciplined distance and repetition. The beginning recedes because dwelling there offers no practical benefit. What matters is the present alignment and the fragile continuity extending forward one careful act at a time. This orientation produces a final philosophical implication. Civilization is not validated by knowing where it came from. It is validated by how it behaves now. Responsibility lies not toward an imagined origin or promised future, but toward the immediate maintenance of order. Each action becomes a test of worthiness. Survival is conditional. Within this framework, the absence of beginnings ceases to feel mysterious. It becomes instructive. It teaches restraint. It teaches acceptance of limits. It teaches that some questions, however compelling, cannot be integrated safely into a fragile system. Silence, then, is not emptiness. It is a boundary that allows the present to stand without collapse. What remains after moving through this long discipline is not a sense of deprivation but clarity. The Sumerian record does not offer comfort through explanation. It offers stability through practice. It does not explain how civilization began. It demonstrates how civilization learned to remain. In that demonstration lies its enduring significance, not as a story of ascent or origin, but as a sustained meditation on survival within constraint. The tablets do not reach backward in longing. They remain steady where they are holding a world together for as long as holding is possible. What finally settles into view is a civilization that never expected permanence. The Sumerian record does not end with resolution or catastrophe, but with continuation held lightly as if aware that even endurance has limits. There is no concluding declaration of meaning, no assurance of direction. The voice remains steady, measured, unresolved, and that restraint is itself the message. Existence within order is never assumed to be deserved. It must be continually justified through correct action, accurate ritual, and faithful repetition. Cities flourish only so long as alignment holds. When alignment weakens, withdrawal follows. This process is not framed as injustice or failure. It is treated as the ordinary condition of the world. Such conditional survival produces a culture of humility. Human beings are portrayed as small, temporary, and dependent. Achievements are acknowledged but immediately moderated. Success invites vigilance rather than pride. Wisdom literature emphasizes moderation, patience, and acceptance of uncertainty. Ambition beyond measure is portrayed as risk rather than virtue. History accordingly is recorded without narrative arc. Events are listed, not dramatized. Chronology exists, but purpose is withheld. History functions as a ledger rather than a story of ascent. This flatness is deliberate. A dramatic arc would imply progress, culmination, or destiny. The Sumerian record offers none of these. Within this framework, the question of beginnings loses relevance. A beginning implies openness and unstructured potential. The Sumerian worldview does not accommodate such a moment. Structure appears primordial, limits precede choice. To imagine a true beginning would be to imagine a world without inherited constraint, and such a world is neither remembered nor desired. Identity follows the same logic. Belonging is performative rather than genealogical. One belongs by acting correctly, not by tracing descent from a founding event. Ritual situates individuals within order regardless of origin. Genealogies exist, but they are abbreviated. Present alignment matters more than distant ancestry. This performative identity produces restraint. Celebration exists, but it is contained. Joy follows form. Excess emotion is suspect because it threatens balance. The absence of celebratory origin myths fits this atmosphere. Celebration belongs to moments of security. The Sumerian world is never secure. It is only held together for now. Environmental reality reinforces this sensibility. Rivers shift course. Floods erase settlements. Fields turn saline. Geography resists permanence. Civilization responds by becoming flexible in location, but rigid in structure. When cities fall, new ones rise nearby, aligned to inherited patterns rather than new visions. Over time, this responsiveness becomes culture. Civilization learns to travel lightly in memory, carrying forward only what is necessary to function. The record reflects this priority. It is dense with procedure and sparse with explanation. What survives is what can be repeated reliably. The silence around beginnings emerges as an expression of discipline. It is not ignorance, it is choice. Origins do not stabilize the present. They invite reinterpretation and challenge inherited authority. Silence preserves cohesion. Cohesion preserves survival. Loss is not absent from the record. Cities fall, names vanish, lifespans shorten. The gods recede. What is absent is fixation. Grief is acknowledged, then absorbed into practice. The world does not promise restoration. It offers only continuation under altered conditions. The record ends as it begins in the middle of things. Lists continue, calendars turn, authority transfers. There is no closure because closure would imply certainty. Civilization persists until alignment fails. When it fails, something else may arise equally provisional. In this sense, the absence of a true beginning mirrors the absence of a true ending. Both express the same restraint. The record refuses symmetry. It denies the comfort of origins and conclusions. It remains focused on the fragile present where action still matters. What survives across millennia is not an explanation of where civilization came from, but a demonstration of how it was lived. Carefully, quietly, with attention to limits. The clay tablets preserve not a myth of creation, but a method of endurance. The silence they leave behind is not empty. It is shaped by experience. It teaches that not every question strengthens what already stands. Some answers destabilize. Some mysteries must remain unspoken so life can continue. In that restraint lies the final legacy of the Sumerian record, a civilization that chose continuity over comprehension. We've reached the quiet edge of tonight's journey, traveller. Not an ending, but a soft place where the story loosens its grip and allows the dark to return. The tablets remain where they always have, half buried in time, their silence intact. Nothing has been solved, nothing has been sealed shut, and somehow that feels right. What we've moved through together was never meant to resolve into certainty. The Sumerian record does not offer conclusions. It offers posture, a way of standing within time without demanding that time explain itself, a reminder that civilizations like stars do not announce their birth or their fading. They simply persist until they don't. Science tells us that entropy increases, that structures erode, that memory requires energy to survive. History tells us that what endures is rarely what is explained, but what is repeated with care. Somewhere between those truths, meaning settles quietly, not as an answer, but as a rhythm. Perhaps some truths do not ask to be understood, only witnessed, only carried for a while. Tonight the universe does not close its hand around this mystery. It leaves it open. The past remains unfinished. The silence still holds weight, and we, small and temporary beneath vast cycles of matter and time, are allowed to rest without needing to know more. So let the questions soften, let the long arc of time drift back into darkness. Stay curious if you wish, or simply rest. Sleep now, traveller. The universe will keep watch.